There's a kind of quiet that only happens inside houses where someone has forgotten something. The kitchen clock keeps ticking, the refrigerator keeps humming, the dog keeps breathing, and somewhere inside that hum, a person has misplaced the name of their own daughter. I know that quiet now. I have spent the last 3 years swimming in it, and I want to tell you how I learned to listen to it. My name is Margaret Holloway. I am 47 years old. I am a forensic accountant, and for 19 years I have made my living reading the documents other people throw away. I read brokerage statements after the lawyers stop reading them. I read loan files after the banks lose interest. I read canceled checks after the families stop speaking. I have testified in probate court in 7 different states. I have written 3 expert reports that ended up as exhibits in front of a jury. I keep a small office on West Adams Street in Chicago. I keep a desk lamp my mother bought me in 1998. I keep a leather notebook with 214 case numbers in it, and not one of those entries prepared me for what my stepmother did. This is the story of how my father put $2.4 million into a living trust, how my stepmother Linda drained that trust down to $700,000 in 18 months, and how she did it with 17 checks, 4 of which carry a signature from a man who had not been able to hold a pen correctly in over a year. My stepmother has a son named Derek. He is 34. He is not my brother, although I called him that for a year out of politeness. He moved into my father's guest room on February 14, 2022, a Tuesday, 14 days before the first check was written. He is still in that house right now, technically, although he doesn't know that I've arranged for the locks to be changed on Friday morning. I want to be very clear about what this story is and what it isn't. This isn't a story about a courtroom shouting match. I never raised my voice once. There were no Thanksgiving shouting scenes in my family. We don't shout. My mother taught me that. My father reinforced it in his own way. By the time I was 12, I had learned that the louder something gets, the less likely it is to be true, so I sat at that kitchen table at 16 and listened. I have listened for 35 years. Listening is the skill that saved the trust. Listening, and the habit my father gave me of counting the number of zeros on every check he ever signed in front of me. He made me count them out loud. He made me say the amount back to him. $13,420. Read it again. $13,420. When I went to bed at 16, I had counted 106 zeros in his lifetime. I have never stopped counting. I knew what was happening 6 months before my stepmother understood that I knew. I let her keep going. I was not being passive. I was being methodical. There is a difference, and the difference matters. By the time she understood, she had already written 17 checks. By the time she understood, my father had already signed 4 of them with a hand that visibly trembled, on dates when he could not tell me his own middle name. By the time she understood, I had already made a copy of every check, every wire confirmation, every LLC filing, every email Linda had sent Derek about the money, and every email Derek had sent back. I want to tell you what I gathered, why I gathered it, and what it cost. It is not a small cost. Before I take you back to the beginning, a quick word. This channel is the only place I tell these stories. I don't do podcasts. I don't do live shows. I don't go on tour. I sit at the same desk my mother gave me a lamp for in 1998, and I write the way I would write if I were keeping a journal nobody was going to read. If that sounds like your kind of story, please tap like. It does more for the channel than you might think. Hit subscribe so the next one finds you. Ring the bell if you want to know the morning a new one comes out, and drop a comment with your city and the time where you are. I read every comment. I read them slowly. Sometimes a comment will tell me something I need to know about a character 3 stories from now. Tonight, I'm taking you back to a Tuesday morning in early March of 2019, when my father walked out of his office carrying a yellow manila folder, set it on the kitchen table across from me, and said the words, "Margaret, I want to show you something I did with Dave Klein." Let me take you back to that morning, to before the trust paperwork, to before Derek, to before the 18 months that took everything, to a Tuesday when my father could still remember my name, and could still remember the year his own father had died, and could still sign a check without his fingers trembling. My father was a civil engineer for 38 years. He spent his career with the New York State Department of Transportation, 2nd District, working out of an office on East Main Street in Rochester. He did not design bridges. That part surprises people. He did not design bridges. He inspected them. He drove a tan Buick with a clipboard on the passenger seat and pulled over at every 3rd bridge in the I-90 corridor between Henrietta and Victor. He tested welds. He documented rust. He wrote reports that were 11 pages long and started with the phrase, On the date and time listed above, the undersigned visited the structure located at. He had a yellow legal pad by the kitchen phone with 12 numbers on it, in pencil, because he could never remember all of them. He had a metal ruler in the junk drawer. He had a coffee mug that said, "Inspect what you expect," which his coworker had given him at his retirement party in 2009. The mug was white, the lettering was navy blue. He drank from it twice a day until it slipped out of his hand in 2022 and broke on the kitchen floor. I have the bottom half of it now. I keep it on my office shelf. The lettering is partly chipped, but it still says, "Inspect what you expect." I have it backward, because that's how he drank from it. Left hand on the handle, the lettering facing away from him. I have it the same way. He kept a second coffee mug in his office at the DOT. The second mug was plain white. He used the second mug at work and the inspect mug at home. He refused to drink coffee from anything that had been given to him by anyone other than his mother. He said the inspect mug had been a present from a man named Phil Kavanaugh, who was the first person to whom he had ever been assigned as a junior inspector in 1972 in Ogdensburg. Phil Kavanaugh died in 2003. My father attended the funeral. He flew to Ogdensburg from Rochester the morning of, drove a rental car to the church, sat in the second pew, did not speak to anyone, drove back to the airport the same night. He did not tell me about the funeral until 2 years later, when he happened to mention Phil's name in passing on a Sunday call. I said, "When did Phil die, Dad?" He said, "A few years back." I said, "Why didn't you tell me?" He said, "It wasn't a thing." That was my father's way of describing anything that mattered. The bridges he inspected, and I want to give you a sense of the bridges because they were a real part of his life for 38 years, were mostly the smaller state route spans over creeks in Monroe and Ontario counties. There were 47 of them on his rotation. 47. He drove the same route every Tuesday and Thursday of every week. He had them in his head. He knew the rivet pattern on the number 14 bridge. He knew the year the deck had been repaved on the number 22. He knew that the number 31 had been struck by a propane truck in 1996 and that he himself had filed the original damage report. He knew that the number 43 had a colony of cliff swallows living under the eastern abutment and that the colony returned each year on April 19th, give or take a day. He wrote up the swallow colony in his report. He did not have to. He wrote it up because he believed the colony was part of the structure. He retired in 2009, in August, on his 63rd birthday, with a small ceremony at the office on East Main Street and a cake from a bakery on South Avenue. He gave a speech. The speech lasted 4 minutes. He thanked Phil Kavanaugh, who was dead by then. He thanked his secretary, whose name was Maureen, who had handled his scheduling for 19 years. He thanked the bridges. The bridges thanked him back, if you can imagine a span across Irondequoit Creek tipping its hat. After the speech, he drove home. He did not go back to the office. He did not need to. He had already given Maureen the keys to his Rolodex. He had already given me the inspect mug. He had already given his reading glasses to the Goodwill on South Avenue. He walked into 218 North 3rd, hung his jacket on the hook by the door, and sat in the chair that was his father's chair in the living room, where he had not sat since 1978, and where he now proceeded to sit every afternoon for the next 14 years of his life. He read 3 newspapers a day. He watched Jeopardy with the sound off and shouted the answers at the screen, which drove my mother crazy, which he enjoyed. He walked the dog twice a day, a brown rescue beagle named Cosmo, until Cosmo died at 14, and he walked the route alone, which was just over 1.5 miles each way, in any weather Rochester could produce, including the weather in late November when the sidewalks freeze and you can hear the salt trucks 2 blocks away. He did not own a cell phone until he was 68. He refused to learn how to send an email. He wrote checks for everything, including his property taxes, which he paid in person at the Henrietta Town Hall every April, in cash, until the office told him they no longer accepted cash in 2011. After that, he used a money order. After that, his life got smaller. Cosmo was a brown rescue beagle with a torn left ear and a habit of sitting on the newspaper while my father tried to read it. Cosmo had been adopted from Lollipop Farm in 1998 after my parents' first beagle, a dog named Henry, had died at 16. Cosmo came home in the back seat of my mother's CRV in a cardboard carrier that said, "Live Animal, this side up," which was taped on every side of the carrier. Cosmo weighed 22 pounds. He smelled, even after baths, of the place where he had lived before, which was a shelter in Honeoye Falls. The smell was a mixture of wet hay, kibble, and a faint metallic tang of old blood. He got over the smell in 3 weeks. My father did not. My father associated Cosmo with that smell for the rest of Cosmo's life, which is how my father decided that Cosmo was his dog, because Henry had been my mother's. From 1998 until Cosmo died in 2012, my father walked Cosmo twice a day, every day. He walked him in the snow, he walked him in the rain, he walked him once, on a Tuesday in July of 2007, when the heat index was 104, and a neighbor saw my father, in his dress pants and a short-sleeve button-down, sweating through the route with Cosmo at his side. The neighbor called my mother to ask whether my father was okay. My mother said, "He is fine. He is walking Cosmo." When Cosmo died in 2012, my father did not cry at the veterinarian's office. He cried in the car on the way home. He said, "I don't think I can do this again." He did not do it again. He walked the route alone. My mother was Eleanor. She was born in 1948 in Brockport, 20 miles west. She met my father at a church picnic in 1970, where he spilled a glass of iced tea on her sandal, and she laughed, and he didn't. And they were married 8 months later at the First Presbyterian Church of Pittsford. She was a librarian for the Monroe County Library System, mostly in the children's section at the Henrietta branch. She read picture books to any kid who wandered in a voice that made even the teenagers slow down at the doorway. She made lemon cake on Sundays. She made chicken pot pie from scratch when my father was upset about a bridge, which happened 4 times a year on average. She died on April 9, 2013, of ovarian cancer, 18 months after diagnosis, 42 days after she stopped recognizing my father at her bedside, which she had done at breakfast every morning of their marriage until that last one. I held the oxygen mask against her face at the end. I am telling you this because you need to know what kind of quiet I come from. My mother's diagnosis came on October 3, 2011. She had been complaining of bloating since July. She had been prescribed a proton pump inhibitor for acid reflux. The proton pump inhibitor did not work. She saw her OB/GYN on the Tuesday after Labor Day. The OB/GYN sent her for an ultrasound. The ultrasound showed a mass. The mass was biopsied on September 29th at Strong Memorial. The biopsy came back on October 3rd, stage 3, high-grade serous. The oncologist was a woman named Dr. Huang, who had a brown ponytail and reading glasses on a chain. Dr. Huang said, "I want to begin chemotherapy within 2 weeks. I want to begin it as soon as we can get an IV in her." My mother started chemo on October 12th. She did 6 rounds. The chemo worked until it didn't. She went into remission in March of 2012. She came out of remission in October of 2012. She died on April 9, 2013, at home, in the bed she and my father had shared, with a hospital bed in the bedroom and a portable oxygen concentrator humming against the wall. The hospice nurse was named Tracy. Tracy had been with us for 11 days. Tracy had not shaved her legs. Tracy was, by her own admission, tired. My father sat in the chair on the other side of the bed, holding my mother's hand from the morning of April 8th until she stopped breathing at 6:17 p.m. on April 9th. He did not eat, he did not sleep, he did not release her hand. I sat at the kitchen table with the door open so I could hear if she changed her breathing pattern, and at 6:17 p.m. I heard my father, who had not made a sound in 38 hours, say very quietly, "Eleanor." That was all. That is still all I hear when I think about my mother. For 11 months after her death, my father did nothing. He did not repaint the bedroom, he did not replace the leaky kitchen faucet, he did not change the sheets on the bed they had shared for 41 years, which is the same bed he still sleeps in. He got up at 6:15, he made coffee with the same Melita pour-over he had used since 1978. He walked the road alone. He ate dinner at 5:30, not 6, because nobody else was there at 6. The house at 218 North 3rd Street in Henrietta, that's the address, 218 North 3rd, had a smell I have not been able to find anywhere since. It was a mixture of lemon furniture polish, the kind in the brown bottle, Mr. Clean on the kitchen floor, a faint petroleum note from the garage where my father kept the Bugle cycle air compressor for his bicycle, and underneath everything a thin trace of cocoa butter from a tin of Pond's my mother had used since she was 17, which still sat on the bathroom shelf, half used until 2022. The smell of that house is what I think of when I think about a place where a person can still live a normal life. Then came Linda. I want to be careful here. Linda Whitfield, later Holloway, is not a monster. Monsters don't get invited to church picnics. Linda brought casseroles. That is the literal fact. She brought a green bean casserole to the parsonage door in March of 2014, 11 months after my mother died, and she brought it again the next week, and the week after that, and eventually my father started bringing her coffee. The casseroles always came in a Pyrex dish that Linda retrieved 2 days later. She had a rotation of 4 Pyrex dishes. They had been in her family since 1979. She was, in those early months, a careful woman. She asked my father how he was sleeping. She asked my father whether he had eaten. She asked my father whether he wanted company on the walk. She did not, in those months, ask my father to make any financial changes. She did not, in those months, ask my father to change the locks. She did not, in those months, ask my father to change the doorbell. She arrived, she brought food. She sat on the porch, she left. I have a photograph of the two of them at a 4th of July picnic in 2014 that I keep in a drawer in the office. She is smiling. He is smiling in that way. He smiled when he was uncomfortable, which is the same way he smiled at his own retirement party. Both of them are holding paper plates with hot dogs. The sky is cloudless. They were married 7 weeks after that. He called me on a Wednesday in late August and told me. His voice was the voice he used when he had just signed something important and was checking his work. Calm. Even. The energy of a man who wanted somebody to confirm he had done it right. I flew in for the ceremony. There was no ceremony. There was a small reception at the back of a restaurant in Fairport called the Wooden Spoon, which has since closed. There were 19 people. I was asked to wear coral. I did not wear coral. I wore navy. I wore a navy dress I had owned since 2008, which was the dress I had been wearing the year I made junior partner. Daniel had bought it for me at a resale shop in Lincoln Park. The dress had a small bow at the back. The bow was slightly crooked. I did not fix it for the wedding. I have a photograph of the bow. It is on my phone under Things to Remember. Linda's son Derek was at the reception. He is the only part of that day I remember with any clarity. He was 30 at the time. He had dark hair he wore long over his collar. He was wearing a black polo shirt and khakis, and a single braided leather bracelet on his left wrist. He had a Gold's Gym membership card clipped to his belt loop, which I have not seen anyone do in this century. He ate 3 plates of the chicken piccata. He laughed twice, both times at things my father said, both times a beat too late. He called my father Russ twice in the first hour. My father did not correct him. My father had been called Russell or Russ since birth. He did not like Russ. I noticed that night. I have not stopped noticing things since I was 12. I did not raise objections to the marriage. I want to say that clearly. I called my father on the Sunday after the reception, and I told him I was glad he wasn't alone. That was the truth. I was glad he wasn't alone. I never said anything about Linda to anyone except my then boyfriend, now husband Daniel, who is an architect in Chicago, and who said, "Margaret, you sound like a witness on cross," which is what he has said every time I've been unusually quiet about a family decision for 19 years now. I was quiet. I let them be. I went home to Chicago. I called every Sunday at 6 p.m. Eastern. That is what we did. I went to work. I kept my cases. I had a client named Vasquez, an estate worth $14 million in which the second wife had moved jewelry out of a safe deposit box over the course of 4 years. I had a client named Polk, a trust in which the trustee had been double paying himself for 7 years. I had a case in Madison, Wisconsin that lasted 5 weeks and produced 11 banker boxes of documents. I had a case in Toledo, Ohio that lasted 8 weeks and produced 9 banker boxes of canceled checks. I sat at that desk. I read those checks. I listened to my voicemails from Linda every Sunday night, because Linda answered the phone on Sundays too now. Linda was a bookkeeper at a roofing company called Ironclad Roofing out of Greece, New York, which is a town just north of Rochester. She had worked there for 9 years at the time of the wedding. She had a small office above the dispatch counter. She answered her own phone. She balanced her own books. She had a son, Derek, who had been working at Ironclad as a project manager, but had, by 2015, been quietly moved out of that job and into something Linda called independent contracting, which means he was doing subcontract labor for the same company under his own LLC. The LLC was called DWH Holdings, LLC. The initials stand for Derek Whitfield Holdings. Whitfield was his last name from Linda's first marriage. The LLC was incorporated in Delaware in 2015. That detail will matter later. The LLC's registered agent was a mail forwarding service at a strip mall in Wilmington. I know this because I read the certificate of formation when it became relevant in 2023. I want to tell you about the trust, because the trust is the center of gravity for this whole story. In late February of 2019, my father called me on a Wednesday afternoon, which was unusual because we spoke on Sundays. He said, "Margaret, I want to do something I should have done 5 years ago. Can you come up Friday?" I drove the 530 miles from Chicago to Henrietta on Friday, parked on the street outside 218 North 3rd, and noticed that the doorbell had been changed. It used to be a brass mechanical chime from 1952. Now it was a wireless plastic button. Linda answered the door. She had on a denim apron. She had flour on her forearms. She said, "He's in the kitchen, honey. He's been waiting since breakfast." She called me honey. She had not been calling me honey before that week. My father was at the table with a yellow manila folder, just as I have described. His glasses were on his nose. He had not shaved. He had on the red plaid slippers my mother had bought him at Sears in 1986, and which he had resoled every 2 years since. He had a fountain pen in his hand, an old Pelican, which he kept in a leather sleeve in his underwear drawer. He had not used the Pelican in years, because he couldn't see the nib. He was using it now on this day because Dave Klein had told him to. The folder contained the documents for the Russell W. Holloway Revocable Living Trust, dated February 25, 2019, prepared by the law firm of Harder Klein and Crane, with offices on State Street in Rochester. The trust held in total $2.4 million, $1.6 million in a brokerage account at Nimson T Bank, in a conservatively allocated portfolio of which the largest single position was a Morgan Stanley Intermediate Bond Fund. $500,000 in a high-yield money market at the same bank, $300,000 in equity in the house at 218 North 3rd. The settlor was Russell, the initial trustee was Russell. The successor trustees in order were David P. Klein, then Margaret R. Holloway. Linda signed the spousal consent. I am telling you the income sources are exact, because forensic accountants care about what is exact. The number that mattered most, however, was the line at the bottom, signed in my father's hand, that read, "I, Russell W. Holloway, hereby transfer all right, title, and interest in the above assets to the trustee of the Russell W. Holloway Revocable Living Trust, to be held, managed, and distributed according to the terms of said trust." We sat at the table. He walked me through the terms. The trust was revocable. He could change it at any time as long as he had capacity. It would become irrevocable upon his death. Upon his death, the assets would be distributed as he specified in a separate pour-over will, but the terms of that pour-over will said, in summary, that the residue would be divided equally between two beneficiaries. The first beneficiary was Margaret R. Holloway. The second beneficiary was Linda J. Holloway, his wife, in her capacity as a surviving spouse. If Linda were to predecease him, the entire residue would go to Margaret. There was no Derek in the trust. Derek was not a beneficiary. There was no other child. There was no other relative. There was just me, and there was Linda. And the trust said so in 5 places. Linda was in the kitchen the entire time. She did not sit at the table. She moved around the room, wiping counters. She made a joke about the size of the document. She kissed my father on the top of the head on her way to the sink. She did not once try to read the document. She did not once try to change the document. She did not ask why Derek was not a beneficiary. I noticed all of this. I will tell you what I did with that noticing later. Just hold it. I read the trust. I highlighted, in pencil, 6 clauses that I wanted to discuss with Dave Klein. I went back to Chicago on Saturday morning. I called Dave Klein on Monday. Dave and I talked for 45 minutes. He confirmed the trust was solid. He told me my father had come in alone, had spent 3 hours with him, had asked the right questions, had signed voluntarily. He told me my father had said, "I want Margaret to be the second trustee. I want Margaret to be the second trustee regardless of what happens to me. I want Margaret to know exactly what I have and exactly where it goes before I can't tell her anymore." That last phrase, "before I can't tell her anymore," is the phrase that haunts me now. My father knew. He knew in February of 2019 that something was wrong with his memory. He didn't know what it was. He didn't have a name for it. He knew there were days when he forgot what he was about to say. There were days when he walked into a room and forgot why. He didn't tell me about those days. He told Dave Klein about them. Dave Klein, who is 69 and has been practicing estate law since I was 23, said to me on that call, "Margaret, your father is aware of his own clock. Your father is aware that his clock is winding down. He did this now because he knows this is the last window in which he can do it correctly." I think about that phone call about once a week. I went back to my clients. I kept counting zeros. I kept my Sunday 6 p.m. calls. Linda answered the phone on most Sundays. She was always cheerful. She always made a joke about how I should come up more. She always said my father was fine, just tired, just at the bridge inspections, just talking to Cosmo's ghost on the morning walk. The call would be 45 minutes. I'd talked to my father for the last 15. He always asked about my cases. He always asked about Daniel. He always asked, in the same phrasing, "How's that lamp of yours?" The lamp, my desk lamp. The lamp my mother had bought me at a Crate and Barrel on North State Street in Chicago in 1998 that no longer exists, but the lamp still does. It still works. It still throws that particular circle of warm light on a leather desk pad. He never forgot the lamp. He forgot my name eventually, but he never forgot the lamp. In July of 2020, my father drove to a bridge on the I-90 corridor near Canandaigua, which is about 30 miles east of Henrietta, and got lost. He got lost on a bridge he had inspected 4 times a year for the previous 26 years. He called me at 6:30 p.m. on a Tuesday. He said, "Margaret, I need you to tell me where I am." I said, "Dad, what do the signs say?" He said, "It says Canandaigua, Margaret." I said, "Okay. You are 30 miles east of home. Turn around and go west on the thruway." He said, "I don't know how to get back on the thruway, Margaret." I drove the 530 miles to Henrietta the next morning. I took him to a neurologist at Strong Memorial Hospital on Elmwood Avenue. They did an MRI, they did a cognitive battery, they did a 15-minute interview with a woman named Dr. Chen, who is a behavioral neurologist. Dr. Chen gave a diagnosis on August 7, 2020, of probable Alzheimer's disease, moderate stage. She said probable because they hadn't done the spinal tap. My father refused the spinal tap. He said, "I am not letting anyone put a needle in my spine at 74. That is who my father is." He was correct to refuse. The diagnosis of probable Alzheimer's is enough for purposes of every legal document that matters. The diagnosis is recorded in the medical record. The diagnosis is signed by a board-certified neurologist. The diagnosis is enough. Linda was at that appointment. She sat in the back of the room. She did not ask questions. She had a small spiral notebook in which she wrote the date and the doctor's name. When we got into the car, my father said, "Margaret, please don't tell anyone." I said, "Dad, I won't." Linda said, "Russ, we don't need to tell anyone. We are going to be fine." My father squeezed my hand in the front seat. He looked out the window. He did not say anything else for the rest of the drive. I increased my calls to twice a week. Then, in 2021, to every weeknight at 7 p.m. I asked my father, every weeknight, "Did you sleep last night? Did you walk the route today? Did Cosmo's ghost come home?" He answered mostly correctly. He confused my name with my mother's name in March of 2021. By August of 2021, he confused my name with the name of his sister, who had died in 2009. I made notes of every one of these confusions, in pencil, in a green moleskin I keep on my desk. The notes run from March 21st, 2021 to October 14th, 2022, which is when I stopped making notes because the notes became unnecessary. Linda in 2021 called me on a Sunday afternoon and said, "Margaret, I want to talk to you about Derek." Derek had, at that point, been living in his own apartment in Greece, New York. He had a girlfriend. He had 2 DUIs, the second from 2018. He worked as an independent contractor for Ironclad. He was current on his child support payments, mostly. He was paying alimony from his first divorce, finalized in 2016. He was not, in the framing Linda used to me, in a stable place. Linda said, "Your father and I have talked and we'd like Derek to move into the guest room at the house for a while, just to help out with Russ, because Russ is getting confused about the bills." She said, "Russ." She was using his name that he didn't like, but she had been using it since 2014. I said, "Linda, that's a big change. Has Dad talked to Dave Klein about this?" She said, "Your father thinks it's a good idea." I said, "I'd like to talk to Dad about it myself." She said, "Let me get him." She put my father on the phone. I asked him, "Dad, are you okay with Derek moving in?" He said, "Yes, Margaret." "We need someone around the house." He said we. That phrasing struck me. He would not have used that phrasing 3 years earlier. I said, "Okay, Dad." I hung up. I added a note in the green moleskine. The note read, the 14th of September 2021, Derek moving in. Dad said yes. He sounded unclear. I did not object, I want to say that. I did not object to Derek moving in. I did not object to the marriage. I did not object to the casseroles. I did not object to the rewritten doorbell. I objected in my own head to a number of things I was noticing, but I did not voice them because I am Margaret Holloway's daughter, and Margaret, my mother, would have said, "Be patient, be slow, be gentle with the people in that house." I tried to be patient. I tried to be slow. I have been listening for 35 years. Derek moved in February 14th, 2022, which was a Tuesday. I know the day because I have the email Linda sent me that Friday with the date typed in the subject line. Linda, in the email, wrote, "Margaret, Derek has moved in, and he's already a huge help with your father's meds. Love, Linda." The medications she was referring to were Aricept, 23 milligrams, taken at night, which Dr. Chen had prescribed. Linda was administering the Aricept. Derek, by his own description to my father, was setting the pillbox. I want to take you through the next 6 months slowly, because the next 6 months are where the quiet stops being normal and becomes something I started writing down. I am going to give you specific dates, because specific dates matter. In March, after Derek moved in, my father stopped calling me on Sundays. He did not stop calling entirely. He called, but the calls came at odd times, often during the week, often on Tuesday or Wednesday, often at 4 or 5 in the afternoon Chicago time, which was 5 or 6 p.m. in Henrietta, which was, I think, around when Derek got home from whatever he had been doing during the day. The Sunday 6 p.m. ritual moved, gradually, to a Sunday midday ritual, then to a Sunday lunch ritual, then to a Sunday ritual where Linda would pick up the phone, talk to me for 10 minutes, and hand it to my father for the last 5 minutes of the call, if at all. By June, I would get a call from my father every other Sunday. By August, I would get one a month. By November, I would get them only when I asked. In April of 2022, Derek got a new truck. The truck was a Ford F-150, XLT trim, dark blue with the tow package. The sticker on the back of the truck said, XLT in chrome. The truck had running boards. The truck had a bed liner. The truck had aftermarket fog lights mounted in the lower grille, which I know because I have a photograph of the truck I took through the kitchen window in May. The truck had not been there in January. I saw it on a video call with my father in May. I said, "Dad, that's a new truck in the driveway." He said, "Derek's new truck." I said, "Derek got a new truck." He said, "Yes." I said, "Is Derek working a lot?" He said, "I think so." I said, "Where is Derek's old truck?" He said, "I don't know." He smiled at me through the screen. I told him I loved him. He said, "I love you too, Margaret." That is the last clean conversation I ever had with my father. The truck had 22-inch alloy wheels. The tires were Nitto-Terra grapplers. The truck had not been leased. It had been financed. I know because I pulled the lien on the truck at the Monroe County DMV website, the public record, in 2023, and the lien was held by a credit union called Empower Federal, and the purchase price before tax was $42,062. The down payment on the truck was $2,000. The remaining balance was financed over 72 months at 7.9% APR. The first payment was due May 1st, 2022. The first 3 payments were made on time. The fourth was made 7 days late. The fifth was made 15 days late. I have copies of the payment history. The truck is still on the property. Derek is no longer on the loan. Over the next 6 months, I noticed, on video calls and on the one weekend I drove up in July, that Derek's life in the house was expanding. He had moved from the guest room to my father's old den, which had been my mother's sewing room. The sewing machine was gone. In its place was a desk, 2 monitors, and a printer. There was a second refrigerator in the garage that Linda and Derek referred to as the beer fridge. The basement had been cleaned out. There were tools I did not recognize, including a tile saw, a wet vacuum, and a stack of lumber I could not account for. Derek was doing work in the house that my father did not appear to be aware of, which I thought was odd, because my father had been meticulous about his house. He would never have let anyone do work on the house without a written estimate and 3 bids. He would have asked questions. He was not asking questions. The kitchen had been rearranged. My father's chair at the kitchen table, the chair he had used for 45 years, the chair with the small chip on its back right leg from when I had swung a croquet mallet at my brother. My father did not have a brother. I mean at my cousin Robert's wedding reception in 1989, had been moved to the corner. Derek's chair was at the head of the table. The yellow manila folder from the trust had been moved from the desk in my father's office to a kitchen drawer. The kitchen drawer was a junk drawer. The yellow manila folder was not junk. The kitchen drawer was, however, where Linda kept her own papers. There were receipts in there for the tile saw. There were invoices in there for the lumber. There were 2 credit card statements, John Lewis Platinum, made out to Linda J. Holloway, paid automatically from a checking account at M&T Bank that was a joint account with my father. The checking account had a balance at the time of the April statement of $162,000. The April statement was the only one I saw up close because I had been in the kitchen on July 23, 2022, and a statement had been on the counter. I asked Linda if I could see it. She said, "Sure, honey, just don't lose it." I read the statement. The balance was $162,312. The transactions were mostly Linda's. Some of them were Derek's. They were not on my father's radar. He was sitting at the corner chair looking at his hands. I drove up for Thanksgiving 2022. Linda had set the table for 9. Derek was there. Derek's ex-wife, whose name is Kelsey, and with whom I had nothing in common, was there. Derek's 2 children, ages 7 and 9, were there. Derek's current girlfriend, a woman named Brittany who worked at a vape shop in Greece, was there. Linda had prepared 2 turkeys, 3 sides, and a sweet potato casserole. My father sat at the head of the table, but he did not eat much. He held his fork in his left hand. He looked at the tablecloth. He called me by my mother's name twice during the meal. He was not able to follow a conversation. Linda, in a move I have replayed in my head 14 times, leaned over and said to him, "Russ, this is Margaret. She's here to see us." He said, "I know who Margaret is." He did not. He looked at me as if I were a stranger who shared his blood. After dinner, Derek's son, age 9, asked my father if he wanted to play catch in the yard. My father looked at the boy for a long time. He said, "I don't have a ball." Derek, from the kitchen doorway, said, "Dad, we have a ball in the garage." My father looked at Derek for a long time. He said, "I'm not your dad, son." Derek laughed. Linda, from across the room, did not laugh. She looked at my father with an expression I have thought about every week since. The expression was not anger. The expression was calculation. I have seen that expression in depositions. I have seen that expression in guilty pleas. I have seen it when people have just realized that the person they have been lying to has stopped being able to verify the lie. At the end of the meal, after Kelsey had left and after Derek had disappeared into the basement, I asked Linda, in the kitchen alone, "Linda, are the bills at the house being paid from the trust yet? I know Dave Klein had set it up so Dad could draw on the brokerage directly for living expenses." Linda said, "Oh honey, Dave is on top of all that. Don't worry about it." I said, "Have any distributions been made from the trust this year?" She said, "I don't really know. The bank just sends us statements. We don't really open them. Your father gets confused." She laughed as she said that. She laughed in a way I did not recognize, because the Linda I had known for 10 years did not laugh about my father's confusion. She laughed about other things. She laughed at family jokes. She laughed when Derek did something clumsy. She did not laugh about my father. I drove back to Chicago on Friday morning. I called Dave Klein. Dave said, "Margaret, the trust is intact. There have been no distributions this year." I said, "Linda is telling me the bank sends statements. She is telling me they don't open them." Dave said, "Statements should go to your father. I don't understand why Linda is opening them." I said, "Dave, when was the last time you spoke to my father directly?" He said, "Margaret, I would say 4 months ago in July, when he came in to sign an amendment." I said, "What amendment?" He said, "He came in to change his power of attorney." I said, "To whom?" He said, "To Linda." I said, "Dave, did you and he discuss whether he wanted to keep me on the POA?" He said, "Margaret, your father came in alone. He did not bring Linda. He asked for the POA to be changed. He signed voluntarily. He had capacity." I said, "Did you observe him signing?" He said, "I did." I said, "Did the signature look like his?" He said, "It looked fine." I want to be very clear here. What Dave Klein is saying is true. My father, in July of 2022, walked into Dave Klein's office alone, sat down, signed an amendment to his power of attorney, and asked that the agent be changed from Margaret to Linda. He did this with capacity. He did this knowingly. This is not the forgery. This is what came before the forgery. This is what made the forgery possible. The amendment Linda had been requesting quietly, on Sunday phone calls and at the kitchen table, was the thing that gave her the legal ability to act on my father's behalf in the world. Once she had the POA, she could speak to the bank, the brokerage, the county recorder, the phone company, the utility, the insurance company, the doctor, the pharmacy, the accountant, and she could do so as my father's authorized agent. The POA was signed in my father's hand, in Dave Klein's office, on a date when my father could still remember the names of his 4 brothers if you gave him 10 minutes. It was a sunny Tuesday. I did not fight the POA change. I want to say that clearly too. I called my father on the Sunday after I learned about it and asked him whether he wanted me on the POA. He said, "Margaret, Linda is here." He paused. He said, "Linda is here, and you are in Chicago. Linda can do what needs to be done." I said, "Dad, is that what you want?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Okay, Dad." I said, "I love you." He said, "I love you too." He hung up. I made a note in the green moleskin. The note read, the 17th of July 2022, POA changed to Linda. Dad said yes. Long pause before answer. I have never shown that note to anyone. In the months after the POA change, the calls from my father became shorter. He was sleeping poorly. Linda told me he was sleeping poorly. He had started in the late summer of 2022 to ask Derek for help with the morning routine. He did not before that ever ask Derek for help with anything. He had been up to that point adamantly independent about his own physical self-care. He walked the route alone. He dressed himself alone. He shaved himself alone. By September of 2022, he was having Derek help him find the bathroom in the morning. By October, he was having Derek help him find his glasses. By December, he was having Derek help him find the year. He was still, in December of 2022, able to feed himself. He was still able to dress himself in the same plaid slippers and the same red plaid shirt, which Linda had bought him 3 of in rotation, so he could wear the same thing every day without her having to wash it each night. The shirt was the color of a fire truck. My father had never worn a fire truck colored shirt before 2022. He wore it now because Linda had put it on the chair for him. I flew to Rochester on December 23rd. I brought Daniel. We stayed at the Residence Inn on Jefferson Road in Henrietta, 4 miles from the house. I told Linda we would come over on Christmas Eve, from 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. We arrived at 4. Derek answered the door. He was wearing sweatpants. He was holding a beer. The house smelled of ham. My father was at the table, where he always was. His hands were folded. The plaid slippers were on. The mug was on the table. There was coffee in the mug. The mug had been refilled since the morning. I sat next to him. I said, "Dad, hi." He said hi. He did not call me by name. He did not call me by my mother's name. He said hi. He was looking at his hands. I said, "Dad, do you want to come for a walk with me?" He said, "Where?" I said, "Out front, around the block." He said, "It's cold." I said, "It is cold, it's also good for you." He said, "Linda, can I go for a walk?" Linda, from the kitchen, said, "Russ, it's freezing out." He looked at me. I said, "I'll make sure you're warm, Dad." He said, "Okay." I got his coat from the closet. The coat was the same plaid-lined barn coat he had worn every winter of his adult life. He let me help him put it on. We walked out the front door. The sidewalk was slippery with freezing rain. I held his arm. We walked 40 yards. He stopped. He said, "Margaret, where are we?" I said, "We're on North 3rd Street, Dad, outside the house." He said, "What house?" I said, "Your house, Dad. 218 North 3rd Street." He looked at the house. He did not recognize it. He stood on the sidewalk for a minute, looking at the house as if it were a place he had once visited. Then he said, "I want to go home." I said, "This is your home, Dad." He said, "Number, I want to go home." I said, "Where is home, Dad?" He said, "I don't know." He started to cry. I held him. Derek, from the living room window, watched us. He did not come out. I brought him back inside. Linda gave him his coffee. He did not drink it. I sat with him for the rest of the evening. He did not recognize Daniel. He did not recognize me. He looked at me, once near the end, and said, "You are kind." That is the word he kept landing on, again and again that evening. "You are kind." I drove back to the Residence Inn at 8 p.m. Daniel and I sat in the room. We did not turn on the television. Daniel said, "Margaret, we need to talk about this." I said, "I know." He said, "How long?" I said, "Months." He said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I am going to be okay. I am going to do something about it." He said, "Tell me what?" I said, "I am going to read the documents. I am going to count the zeros. I am going to wait." He said, "Wait for what?" I said, "Until every check has cleared." He said, "Margaret." I said, "I know." In January of 2023, I went to my father's house unannounced. I told Linda I was coming. I told her I would arrive on a Thursday at 2 p.m. I told her I would stay until Sunday. I told her I was bringing Daniel, my husband, who is 6'1" and 190 pounds, and who, when he walks into a room, changes the room, which is the polite way of saying that Daniel looks like a man you do not want to lie in front of. Daniel and I arrived at 218 North 3rd Street on Thursday, January 12, 2023 at 1:58 p.m. We knocked. Derek answered the door. He was wearing the same black polo shirt he had worn at the wedding. He still had the leather bracelet. He had a beard now. He said, "Margaret, hey." He did not invite us in. He stepped aside. Daniel and I walked past him. The house smelled the way it had smelled when my mother was alive, which surprised me because Linda did not clean the way my mother cleaned. Linda cleaned with sprays, my mother cleaned with vinegar. The smell that day was the vinegar smell, which I had not smelled in this house in 10 years. I noticed that. I will tell you what I think about the vinegar smell later. Just hold it. My father was in the kitchen. He was sitting at the kitchen table in the red plaid slippers, but the slippers were new. The old pair had been resoled for the last time in 2019, and the leather had been worn down to the cork. He had a fresh pair of the same plaid slippers. They were stiff. They made a sound on the linoleum. He said, "Margaret," he knew who I was. I sat next to him. I asked him how he was. He said, "I'm fine." I asked him if he had eaten. He said, "Linda made a casserole." I asked him if he had walked the route. He said, "I don't walk the route anymore, Margaret. The route is too cold." I asked him if he could tell me the date. He said, "It's January." I asked him if he could tell me the year. He said, "I think it's 2023. I cried in the bathroom. I came back. I told him I loved him. He said, "I love you too, Margaret." That night, after Derek and Linda had gone to bed, I went to the office in the back of the house. The office had been my father's. He had a metal desk. He had a Rolodex. He had a yellow legal pad on the desk. There were 15 numbers on it, including the law firm, the accountant's office, the pharmacy, and the Manti branch where the trust brokerage account lived. I sat at the desk. I opened the Rolodex. Behind the M card, I found a folder of bank statements. Behind the K card, I found a folder of brokerage statements. Behind the F card, I found a folder of utility bills. The folders were in Linda's handwriting. The folders were labeled Russ Holloway, Bank. Russ Holloway, Stocks. Russ Holloway, Bills. I have the originals, I have copies, I have scans. I want you to understand that I am telling you what is in them. The brokerage statement showed 17 checks. The first check was dated March 1st, 2022, 14 days after Derek moved in. The first check was payable to DWH Holdings LLC in the amount of $12,000. The second check was payable to DWH Holdings LLC in the amount of $14,000. The third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh checks were also payable to DWH Holdings LLC, ranging from $9,000 to $23,000. By the end of 2022, there were 9 checks to DWH Holdings LLC, totaling $129,000. In 2023 through November, there were 8 more checks to DWH Holdings LLC, totaling $171,000. The total to DWH Holdings LLC across the 2 years was $300,000. There were also checks to Ironclad Roofing, totaling $28,000. There was a check to a car dealership in Webster for $42,000. There was a check to an interior designer in Pittsford for $27,000. There were checks to 2 home improvement contractors totaling $64,000. There were 3 checks totaling $15,000 written to a travel agency in Greece, New York for a trip to Cozumel. There were checks to a credit card payoff, a tax payment, and a series of smaller cash withdrawals. The total dollar value of the 17 checks was $1.7 million. After those 17 checks, the balance of the trust, as of the November statement, was $709,412. Of the 17 checks, 4 were signed in a hand that was not my father's. The 4 were dated August 22, 2022, November 19, 2022, February 7, 2023, and June 3, 2023. The signatures on those 4 checks differed from my father's known signature in 11 different ways. I counted. I compared them to the signature on the trust, which was witnessed by Dave Klein, and which I have a copy of, and to the signature on the power of attorney amendment, which Dave Klein also witnessed. The signatures on the 4 checks were written by someone who had studied my father's hand. The slant was correct. The pressure was not. The kerning between letters was wider. The pen was a ballpoint, not the fountain pen my father used. The 4 checks in total were for $378,000. The forged signatures were the 4 largest checks. The forgery was an inside job. There is no other explanation. The pen was the same pen. The hand was the same hand. The 4 checks had been written from the same checkbook, on the same desk, on the same kitchen table, in the same house, by the same person. I want to walk you through the cleanest of the 4 checks, because it will give you a sense of the work a forensic document examiner does. The check is dated February 7, 2023. It is payable to DWH Holdings, LLC, in the amount of $112,480. The signature line reads Russell W. Holloway in what is intended to be my father's hand. Under a 30-power loop, 3 anomalies are visible. The downstroke on the W in Holloway is shorter than the same W on the trust document. The pen lifts at the end of the L in Russell that do not appear on the trust signature. The kerning between the letters in Holloway is roughly 15% wider than the trust signature. The forgery was not done by an amateur. It was done by someone who had seen my father sign his name at least 50 times. It was done by someone who had sat at that kitchen table across from my father, with coffee, while my father signed check after check for the household bills, and who had watched the signature and who had practiced it. I sat at my father's desk for 40 minutes that night. I did not turn on the lamp. I used my phone flashlight. I photographed every page. I put the folders back exactly as I had found them, behind the same Rolodex cards, in the same order, with the same paper clips. I left the office. I went to bed. I did not tell Daniel yet. I did not tell Linda. I did not tell Dave Klein. I drove Daniel back to Chicago on Sunday morning. I made one stop on the way, at a print shop on Jefferson Road, where I made 2 paper copies of the brokerage statement, one paper copy of which I sealed in a manila envelope and mailed to my office in Chicago, and the other of which I sealed in an envelope and put in a safe deposit box at a branch of a bank that has no relationship to the family. The 3rd copy was the one I keep in the green moleskin, folded, with a date on it that I will not share with you because I do not need anyone finding it. When I got home to Chicago, I called my cousin, who is a forensic accountant at a firm in Atlanta, who agreed, on a Sunday, to look at the documents and give me a written opinion. His name is Robert. Robert Holloway is my father's sister's son. He is 50. He has been a CPA since 2001. He has testified in federal court. He is not the kind of man who uses words carelessly. I sent him the scans. He wrote me back within an hour. He flew up to Rochester the following Wednesday. He met Daniel and me at a diner on Chile Avenue. He had a paper folder with him. He had a 40-power loop. We sat in a booth. He did not eat. He looked at the documents for 90 minutes. When he was done, he closed the folder. He said, "Margaret, 4 of these signatures are not your father's. They are attempts to mimic your father's signature by someone who has had opportunity to study it. 3 of the signatures are genuine. 3 of the signatures are the signature on the trust, the signature on the POA, and the signature on a check paid to the Monroe County Water Authority in October of 2021. He paused. He said, "Margaret, the trend line on the genuine signatures is downward. The signatures on the trust, the POA, and the Water Authority check are all consistent with your father's hand at a stage when he could still hold a pen. The signatures on the 4 checks are not just non-matching. They are non-matching in a way that suggests the forger was working from memory, not from a template. There is a slight variation across the 4 forgeries. The variation is consistent with someone who was repracticing the signature each time." He looked at me. He said, "Margaret, do not tell Linda you have these." I said, "I will not." He said, "Do you want me to write the opinion?" I said, "Yes. I want it in 14 pages or more, with citations in a format a prosecutor can hand to a grand jury." He said, "Give me 10 days." He sent me a draft opinion on a Tuesday. The opinion ran to 14 pages. It concluded, in summary, that the signatures on the 4 checks were not written by Russell W. Holloway, and that the most likely author was an individual who had routine access to his checkbook and who had the ability to study his signature in advance. The opinion also included a timeline of the 17 transactions. The timeline included, in highlighted rows, the 4 checks with the non-matching signatures, and a notation that read, in block letters, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult by the law, Section 460 ETSEQ. The opinion was signed on page 14 by Robert, with his bar number, his CPA number, and his forensic accounting certification. The opinion also carried a second signature in the lower right corner from a board-certified forensic document examiner named Susan B. Vance, who runs a lab in Syracuse, who had been retained by Robert to do an independent signature analysis. Vance had examined the 4 signatures under a 50-power microscope. Vance had written a single-paragraph addendum on page 13, in which she said, in summary, that the 4 signatures were inconsistent with a written hand from a person of Russell Holloway's known age and known medical condition, that the 4 signatures were consistent with a memorized reproduction, and that the writer was right-handed. My father was right-handed. Derek was right-handed. In the same week, I pulled the deed record from the Monroe County Clerk's website. The deed record was filed on July 8, 2022. The grantor was Russell W. Holloway by Linda J. Holloway, attorney-in-fact. The grantees were Linda J. Holloway and Derek W. Whitfield, as joint tenants with right of survivorship. The recording fee was $62. The document was signed by Sandra O'Connor, a notary public commissioned in the state of New York. The notary's commission number was on the document. I did not, at that moment, contact Sandra O'Connor. I filed her name in the green moleskin in pencil in a new page called People to Call Before April. In February of 2023, I retained an estate litigation attorney named Patricia Donovan, who practices at a firm in Buffalo. Patricia is 61. She has been doing estate litigation since she was 28. She has a courtroom laugh that when she uses it during a deposition makes opposing counsel lose their train of thought. I told Patricia everything over the course of 3 meetings, each of which lasted about 2 hours. The first meeting was a Saturday morning in her office on Delaware Avenue. Daniel came with me. Robert, on speaker from Atlanta, was on the line. Patricia took handwritten notes in a yellow legal pad, which is exactly the kind of detail that I find reassuring in a litigator. She used a number 2 pencil. She underlined things 3 times. At the end of the first meeting, she said, "Margaret, you have a case. I will know how strong it is in 2 weeks. I want to see the originals." I shipped the originals to her in a banker box on Monday. I sent them by FedEx Priority overnight. I sent them with a chain of custody letter. I had Robert notarize at his office. At the second meeting, 2 weeks later, Patricia told me the case was strong. She had the originals. She had pulled the deed from the Monroe County Clerk's office in person, because she does not trust the website. The clerk's office on South Main Street had given her a printout dated February 16, 2023. The deed transfer, recorded on July 7, 2022, transferred the house at 218 North 3rd from Russell W. Holloway to Linda J. Holloway and Derek W. Whitfield as joint tenants with right of survivorship. The signature line on the deed read, Russell W. Holloway by Linda J. Holloway, attorney-in-fact. Linda had used the POA. The deed did not require my father's signature. It only required the signature of the agent. Linda had signed it as the agent. The deed had been notarized by a notary named Sandra O'Connor, whose commission was current, and who had been booked through a mobile notary service that does notaries for $275 a pop cash in any Starbucks in the greater Rochester area. The notarization was clean. The notary had done her job. The notary would 6 months later, in a deposition, say that she had not met my father in person, and that she had relied on Linda's representation that the document was genuine. The county recorder's office had accepted the deed. The deed was on record. The house, which my father had owned free and clear since he paid off his mortgage in 1998, which the trust held a $300,000 interest in, was now jointly owned by his wife and his stepson, with right of survivorship. That meant that on my father's death, the house would pass to Linda and Derek outside of probate, outside of the trust, and outside of any will. The $300,000 interest in the trust would not be distributed to the trust residue. It would simply vanish from the trust, because the trust no longer had any interest in the house to distribute. Patricia said, "If this holdup had succeeded, your stepmother and her son would have walked away with $2.7 million. The trust would have been empty. The estate would have been empty. You would have been left with nothing but a court date." I said, "Patricia, is that where this was heading?" She said, "Margaret, I have seen 6 of these in my career. They always head there. They always head there when there is no second trustee paying attention." Patricia filed, on February 22, 2023, in Monroe County Surrogate's Court, a petition for appointment of successor trustee, an order to show cause, an emergency motion to suspend existing trustee, and a verified complaint for damages for financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. The petition named me as the proposed successor trustee. The petition named Linda and Derek as respondents. The petition named DWH Holdings LLC as a respondent. The petition named the New York State Office of Adult Protective Services as a mandatory reporter recipient. The petition contained, as exhibits, the brokerage statements, the 4 checks with the question signatures, the deed, the notary's notarization, and my cousin Robert's expert opinion. The petition was 43 pages. The petition's caption read, "In the matter of the Russell W. Holloway Revocable Living Trust, dated the 25th of February 2019. The case number was 23P20877. I have the case number on a post-it note on my desk. At the same moment, I made 4 other moves. I sent the brokerage statements, in a sealed envelope, by certified mail, to M&T Bank's Trust Services Department in Buffalo, with a cover letter stating that I had reason to believe that 4 checks drawn on the account bore forged signatures, and that I was requesting that the bank freeze the account pending the outcome of the petition. I received an acknowledgement of receipt on March 1st. The acknowledgement was signed by a woman named Karen Pelton, who is the Senior Vice President for Trust Administration at M&T. Karen called me on March 3rd. Karen said, "Miss Holloway, we received your letter. We take this very seriously. We have placed a hold on the account pending court order." I said, "Karen, thank you." She said, "Miss Holloway, I have been doing this for 23 years, and I want you to know that we did not flag any of these transactions because we were not aware of your father's medical condition. The 4 checks cleared our fraud filters because the signatures on their face were consistent with the signature we had on file. The signatures were not flagged. The dollar amounts were not flagged. The payee was not flagged. The only reason you are catching this is because you are doing your own work." I thanked her. I told her that the forgeries had been analyzed by an independent document examiner. She asked me to send her a copy. I sent her a copy. She sent back a 1-line acknowledgement. I made a written report to the Monroe County Department of Social Services, Adult Protective Services Unit, which is mandatory under New York law for any person who has reason to believe that a vulnerable adult is being financially exploited. The caseworker assigned to the report was named Carla. I spoke to Carla for 45 minutes on March 3rd. Carla took notes in a spiral notebook. Carla asked me, "Is your father currently in danger?" I said, "Carla, my father is being financially drained, and I do not believe Linda or Derek have any intention of stopping." She said, "We will open a case." She opened a case. She scheduled a home visit for March 9th. Carla did the home visit. Carla called me afterward. Carla said, "Miss Holloway, I interviewed your father. Your father does not recognize his own bedspread. Your father did not know where the bedroom was. I recommended to APS that he be removed from the home, but APS wants the family to make the move voluntarily." I said, "Carla, I will make the move voluntarily. I will move him on my own. Please give me 3 weeks." Carla said, "3 weeks is what I will give you." I filed a complaint with the New York State Police Troopy, which covers the Rochester area, and which has a unit dedicated to financial crimes against the elderly. The investigator's name was Detective Sergeant Luis Mercado. Sergeant Mercado told me on the phone that he had in his career seen 47 living trusts drained in exactly this manner, and that my timeline and my documents were the most organized he had ever received. I asked him whether that was a compliment. He laughed and said, "Ma'am, it's a compliment and a warning. People who organize this well get held in contempt less often." I sent him the documents by secure upload the next day. Sergeant Mercado called me back on Friday and said, "Miss Holloway, the case is moving to the DA's office. I want you to be patient. Grand jury takes time." I said, "I have waited 13 months, Sergeant Mercado. I can wait another 2. He said, "2 should do it." It took 9 weeks. I filed a petition for guardianship in Monroe County Surrogate's Court, asking for a limited guardianship of the person of my father, on the grounds that he was no longer able to make decisions about his own health and safety. The guardianship petition included a letter from Dr. Chen, dated March 5, 2023, which stated that Russell Holloway was no longer able to manage his own finances, his own medications, his own residence, or his own personal hygiene. The letter was 1 page. It was signed in blue ink. Dr. Chen's office called to confirm that the letter was genuine. The letter was entered into the court record as Exhibit G. The next thing I did was the hardest thing. I retained a placement agency that specializes in memory care, in the same week as the filings, and arranged for my father to be moved to a memory care facility in Brighton, New York, called Lindenwood. Lindenwood is 2 miles north of the house on North 3rd Street. Lindenwood has 48 residents on the memory care wing. Lindenwood has a locked outdoor garden with a fountain that turns on in May. Lindenwood costs $11,400 a month. I am paying for it out of my own account, plus some of the trust residue with Patricia's approval. Lindenwood has a staff-to-resident ratio of 1:4 on the day shift. The day shift workers at Lindenwood know my father's name. They know he likes his coffee black. They know he likes the same chair by the window. Linda had been calling the shots in the house for 15 months at that point. Derek had been sleeping in my father's old den for 13 months. The locks at 218 North 3rd were still the same locks. The deed had been transferred. The trust had been partially drained. My father could not tell me who Derek was on a Wednesday in March. I could not leave him in that house. I called Linda on a Tuesday and told her that I had arranged for my father to move to a memory care facility and that I was paying for it out of my own account and that the decision was not negotiable. She said, "Margaret, you can't do that. He's my husband." I said, "Linda, he is also my father, and he is being financially exploited, and the police are involved, and the guardianship petition will be heard on April 11th, and I would like you to have an attorney present at that hearing, and I would like Derek to be out of the house by April 1st. She was quiet for 19 seconds. I counted. Then she said, "Margaret, you will regret this." I said, "I will. I already do." "But we are doing it," she said. "What about Derek?" I said. "Derek can stay with his girlfriend. He has his truck, he has his LLC, he has $300,000 he should not have." She hung up. I added a note in the green moleskin. The note read, "The 21st of March 2023. Linda called. She said I will regret this. Locks changed at 2:18 on Friday." I drove to Rochester on Friday, March 24th, 2023, with a locksmith I had hired, a man named Tom Riley who runs a one-man shop on Mount Hope Avenue. Tom arrived at 10 a.m. Derek had moved his things to his girlfriend's house in Greece on Wednesday. He had taken the desk, he had taken the second refrigerator, he had taken the tile saw and the wet vacuum. He had left the bed frame in the guest room. The house was quieter than I had ever heard it. I sat at the kitchen table for 10 minutes. The yellow manila folder was gone. The Rolodex was gone. The metal ruler was still in the junk drawer. I left a copy of the new keys on the kitchen counter for Linda, in an envelope with her name on it. The original keys were in my pocket. Tom changed the deadbolts on 3 doors. He changed the locks on the storm door. He gave me 6 new keys. I paid him $240 in cash and tipped him $40. He said, "Ma'am, do you need anything else?" I said, "I need you not to tell anyone you were here." He said, "Ma'am, I don't even remember my last client's name." He gave me a thumbs up. He drove away. I left. My father was moved to Lindenwood on March 26th. I took him. I drove the Buick. The tan Buick was still in the garage where Derek had parked it between his truck and Linda's SUV, with a dead battery which I had jumped on Friday. My father sat in the front seat. He held his travel mug, the Inspect mug. I had packed the bottom half of the Inspect mug, with the chipped lettering, in a separate bag. He did not know why we were driving. He said, "Margaret, where are we going?" I said, "We're going to a new home, Dad." He said, "Is Linda coming?" I said, "Linda is not coming right now." He said, "Okay." He did not ask another question. He squeezed my hand. He looked out the window. The snow was falling on the thruway. The salt trucks were out. The speed limit was 65. We got to Lindenwood at noon. He had a room on the 2nd floor. The window looked out over the garden. The garden has a small fountain. The fountain was off in March. It would be turned on in May. Linda did not come. Linda had been informed that she was not welcome at the facility pending the outcome of the guardianship petition. She did not visit on the day of the move. She did not call. She sent an email at 11 p.m. that night that read, "Margaret, I will be calling the police to report my husband as missing." I replied at 7:22 a.m. the next morning with a single line. "Linda, your husband is at Lindenwood, 1650 Elmwood Avenue in New Brighton. He is safe. He is being cared for. He is not missing." She did not reply. She did not call the police. The April 11th hearing lasted 3 hours. Patricia presented her case. The court appointed a guardian ad litem, an attorney named Hank Bauer, who interviewed my father at Lindenwood on April 8th, who reported in a sworn affidavit that my father could not identify Linda by name, could not identify Derek by name, could not say where he lived, and could not sign his own name on a request form. The court suspended Linda as trustee. The court froze the M&T account. The court appointed a neutral interim trustee, a man named Elliot Park, who practices in Pittsford. The court removed Linda's POA. The court appointed Patricia's firm as escrow agent for the trust proceeds. The court scheduled a follow-up hearing for June 5th to hear the merits of the petition and the financial exploitation complaint. On May 15, 2023, Derek was indicted by a Monroe County grand jury on 4 counts of forgery in the second degree, 4 counts of criminal possession of a forged instrument, 4 counts of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, 1 count of grand larceny in the second degree, and 1 count of conspiracy. The indictment was 48 pages long. It names the 4 checks, it names the notary, it names the LLC, it names Robert's expert opinion, it names the dates. The indictment was signed by ADA Carla Reyes, who is the chief of the Financial Exploitation Unit. ADA Reyes called me on the day the indictment came back. She said, "Miss Holloway, the grand jury indicted on every count. We are now in a position to proceed." I said, "Thank you." She said, "Do you want me to call your father?" I said, "Number. My father does not know what an indictment is. He does not know who Derek is. He would not recognize the name Carla Reyes if she walked into his room." She said, "I understand." I said, "Carla, I do want you to know that I have kept a record of every conversation we have had. I have kept a record of every document I have sent you. I will keep a record of every conversation we have going forward." She said, "Miss Holloway, that is exactly how a witness should behave." I hung up. I cried in the shower that night. On June 5, 2023, the court issued an order directing the DWH Holdings LLC bank account to be frozen, directing the disbursement of $170,000 in legal fees from the trust to Patricia's firm, directing the disbursement of $100,000 to a special needs trust for my father, and directing the residue of the trust, after all fees, to be held in escrow pending the resolution of the criminal case against Derek. The court also issued an order of protection against Linda, prohibiting her from contacting my father, from contacting me, from contacting the bank, from contacting the brokerage, from contacting Patricia's firm, or from contacting the surrogate's court, except through counsel. The order of protection is in effect until 2028. Linda was not charged in the indictment because the DA's office, after reviewing the case, believed that Linda did not directly sign the 4 checks. The DA believed, based on the evidence, that Linda directed Derek to sign them, that Linda set up the LLC, that Linda recruited the notary, that Linda arranged the deed transfer, and that Linda had motive, means, and opportunity. The DA also believed that Linda was more likely to cooperate as a witness against Derek if she was not facing charges herself. I am not in love with that decision. I am not happy with it. I would have preferred to see Linda in handcuffs. I would have preferred it more than I can tell you. But Patricia told me in her office on a Tuesday in May that the DA's call was the right one, because Derek was the forger. Derek was the one who put the pen to paper. Linda had directed him. Linda had made it possible. Derek had used the pen. I said, "Patricia, I want to be clear that I do not forgive Linda." Patricia said, "Margaret, forgiveness is a luxury the law does not afford you, and you are not required to offer it." I thanked her. I went home. I did not call Linda on Sunday. In August of 2023, I received a check in the mail from the trustee Elliot Park. The check was for $93,412 drawn on the M&T escrow account. The check was the first principal distribution from the trust to me. The check came with a 1-page cover letter from Elliot, on his letterhead, which read in part, "This distribution represents the residue interest at the time of re-administration, net of legal fees, net of trust administration fees, net of the special needs trust allocation for your father, and net of the funds currently held in escrow pending final resolution of the criminal matter. Further distributions may be made at the close of the matter." I sat with the check on my desk next to the bottom half of the inspect mug for 2 weeks. I read it out loud. I read it again. I deposited it on a Friday. The amount is now in a money market in my name at a bank that has no relationship to my family. It is now Christmas Eve of 2023. I am at Lindenwood. I am sitting next to my father's bed. The snow is falling outside the window. The garden fountain is off for the season. The monitor is beeping at 62 beats per minute newt, which is the rate at which my father's heart has chosen to spend the rest of his time on this earth. Derek is in the Monroe County Jail on $250,000 bond. Linda is in the house at 218 North 3rd Street, alone, with the locks changed, with the deed soon to be voided, with the trust soon to be re-administered under a neutral trustee. The 4 forged signatures are on file with the DA's office. The 14-page expert opinion from my cousin Robert is on file with Patricia's firm. The notary, Sandra O'Connor, is on file with the court. The green moleskine is on my desk in Chicago. The bottom half of the mug is on my office shelf. The lamp my mother bought me is throwing its usual circle of warm light. I am telling you this story because there is a kind of quiet that only happens in houses where someone has forgotten something, and there is another kind of quiet that only happens in houses where someone has decided to remember. My father does not always remember my name. He has called me Margaret's name more often than he has called me by my own. He has called me his sister's name. He has called me the lamp lady. He has called me the visitor who knows my checks. Yesterday afternoon, when I sat down next to him, he looked at me for a long time and said, "I know who you are. You are the woman who came to fix my checks." I said, "Yes, Dad." He said, "Did you fix them?" I said, "Yes, Dad. I fixed them." He said, "Thank you." He took my hand. He held it for the rest of the afternoon. He did not let go. I sat with him while the snow came down. I sat with him while the monitor beeped. I sat with him while the garden fountain, which he has never seen because it was off on the day he moved in, and he has not been able to leave the building, lay waiting under the snow for May, when it will be turned on again by someone, and will run for as long as anyone remembers to keep it running. If you have stayed with me this long, thank you. I know this one was longer than most. Some of you came in halfway. Some of you will come back tomorrow. I have one final thing to say, and then I will let you go. I grew up in a house where my father taught me to count the zeros on every check he ever signed in front of me. He made me say the amount back to him. "Read it again, Margaret." I read it again. I have never stopped reading them. I read them for him now. I will keep reading them until there is no one in my family who needs them read to them, and then I will read them for someone else's family. That is what a forensic accountant does when she is paying attention. She does not yell. She does not slam doors. She reads the document. She listens to the quiet. She counts the zeros. She writes the timeline. She waits until every check has cleared. She lets them think they have won. And then she reads the document to the court, in a calm voice, on a Tuesday, in April, with snow on the ground. If this story moved you, tap like. It tells the channel that quiet is welcome here. If you want the next one in your feed the morning it drops, hit subscribe and ring the bell. I will see you on Sunday. The next story in the description is about a sister I almost lost to a similar thing. You can read it, but I think you know how it ends before I do.